There's this one memory from middle school that has stuck with me my entire life. It was early April, and the snow had finally melted enough to just wear a light jacket. The pavement felt solid under my feet, and the air was just so crisp and easy to breathe. I was walking home from basketball practice. I had my leather backpack in one hand and my gym bag slung over my shoulder. It was an incredibly gloomy evening. The sky was pitch black, hanging heavy over the town. The only things fighting off the dark were these dull, orange streetlights. I kept right to the edge of the shadows. I remember breathing in that earthy smell of damp soil and wet bark. To my left, there was a new housing development. But to my right, there was this old, dense patch of woods. It was a thick wall of poplars and maples, completely blending into a single ink-black blob. Not a single sound came from in there. Give it another couple of weeks, and that silence would be gone. The woods would be full of birds and bugs buzzing around, all woken up by the spring sun. But right then, out of nowhere, this heartbroken voice called out from the darkness. Why? I froze instantly and turned toward the trees. It sounded exactly like a woman crying. Then, nothing but dead silence again. The only sound was a bus humming way off on the main avenue. I told myself it wasn't my business and started walking again. But then, the voice came back. Why? There was definitely someone out there in the dark. I stopped again, squinting into the shadows. And sure enough, standing out against the dark tree trunks, I could see a lone figure swaying back and forth. You could just tell from the way she was standing how utterly miserable she was. Her head was practically resting on her chest, and her shoulders were just completely slumped. She moved like she didn't even have control of her own body, just sort of shuffling through the wet grass, barely able to stay on her feet. Why? She wailed again. Now, my mom raised me right. She drilled it into my head that you don't just walk away when someone needs help. So, I carefully stepped off the pavement and onto the muddy ground. I called out into the dark. Hey, did somebody hurt you? But she just kept groaning that same word over and over, like a broken record. Why? I started walking toward the shadow. Please, let me help you. By now, my eyes were adjusting to the dark, and everything was coming into focus. I could finally get a decent look at her. But honestly, she barely looked human. It was the most bizarre thing I had ever seen. And no, it wasn't just a trick of the shadows. She seriously looked like a giant rag doll. Her face was just this swollen, lumpy mess. Even the wrinkles didn't look real. They looked like creases in some dirty, stained piece of cloth. Her hair was this sticky, tangled bird's nest hanging down, looking exactly like strands of gray yarn. A little bit of light from a street lamp caught her face, and that's when I saw her eyes and mouth. They weren't real. They were literally stitched on with colored thread, these crooked, ugly stitches, with blood and pus oozing right out of them. Her arms were just dangling by her sides, with these huge, swollen fingers that didn't even have nails. And she was dressed in these shredded, faded rags that looked like they were rotting away. Just staring at this ragwoman made the world start spinning. My head was pounding, and I felt completely sick to my stomach. It was like she was giving off this invisible, toxic energy, mixed with this absolutely horrible smell of decay. Just her being there felt like it was sucking all the air out of the space around us. I could barely breathe. Why? The doll moaned one more time, suddenly throwing up her swollen arm. And then, I screamed in pain. Suddenly, something incredibly sharp stabbed right into my right shoulder, going straight through my thick jacket. Pure panic took over. All my good intentions completely vanished, and I took off running like a terrified dog. But chasing me out of the woods wasn't enough for her. She was coming after me. I could hear these sickening, wet footsteps right behind me, like somebody slapping soaking wet rags against the pavement. I just had to look back. She was right on my heels. Her head and arms were just violently whipping around in every direction, like she didn't even have bones. I bolted out onto a well-lit street and screamed my lungs out. Help! But nobody answered. The street was totally empty. It was still pretty chilly out, so everyone was just staying cozy inside. I sprinted past a construction fence, heading toward the nearby apartment complexes. My own house was still a good 2 long blocks away, but right in front of me was a familiar brick apartment building. It was where my grandma lived. I ran as hard as I could, but that swollen creature was impossibly fast. Those wet, squishy footsteps were getting terrifyingly close. I made a split-second decision. I had to get inside Grandma's place. I just needed to lose this monster. giving it everything I had. I cleared the front stoop 3 steps at a time. I yanked open the heavy front door and was already flying up to the 2nd floor before it even slammed shut behind me. By the time I hit the 4th floor landing, I almost crashed right into the electrical box. I stopped and looked down the stairs. Nothing. Dead quiet. The woman hadn't come inside. Thank God. I had actually lost her. My throat was burning, and every single breath came out as a painful wheeze. I reached out and pushed the doorbell. Instantly, a shooting pain shot through my arm. In all the chaos, I completely forgot I had been hit. And in the most bizarre way, too. Sticking right out of my shoulder were literal sewing needles, complete with trailing thread. There was one really thick needle with a huge eye. Another one was slightly smaller. And then there were 2 tiny, super thin ones that had dug in the deepest. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled them out, one by one, dropping them onto the hallway floor. "Who is it?" My grandma's familiar voice called out from behind the door. "Grandma, it's me." The door swung open, and there was my grandma, looking as cozy as ever. She was wearing her faded, light blue robe with a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders. Her silver hair was perfectly curled, and she had this warm, familiar sparkle in her eyes. Just seeing her instantly grounded me, like I was finally back in the real world. She was always so happy to see me. "Emmy, sweetie, come on in," she said with a smile. I stepped inside and immediately locked the deadbolt behind me. At least now, whatever that nightmare was, it was locked outside. "Oh my goodness, you're absolutely covered in sweat. Were you running home from gym class?" she asked. "Yeah, I lied. Hey, is it okay if I crash here tonight?" My shoulder was absolutely on fire, my brain felt totally foggy, and I kept seeing these dark spots swimming in my vision. But there was no way I was going to tell her what actually happened. It would sound completely insane. Plus, I honestly felt pretty embarrassed about the whole thing. I mean, I practically walked right up to some crazy woman in the dark. "Of course you can stay. You don't even have to ask," she told me. I dropped my backpack and gym bag in the corner, kicked off my sneakers, and headed straight for the bathroom. I desperately needed a drink of water, to wash my face, and to finally check out my shoulder. I peeled off my jacket. Right there, on my shirt, was a bloodstain the size of my hand. I quickly unbuttoned my shirt and pulled it down. The puncture marks were actually pretty tiny, but I knew I had to clean them. God knows where those needles had been. The last thing I needed was some horrible infection. "Are your mom and dad fighting again?" Grandma called out through the door. "No, they're perfectly fine, same as always," I called back, scrubbing my shoulder raw with a regular bar of soap. "Make sure you call them and let them know you're sleeping here." "I will, just give me a second." I had to wait for her to go into the living room. Otherwise, she definitely would have noticed my bloody shirt. Thank goodness my parents insisted on Grandma having a landline, because there was zero chance I was going back outside to find a payphone. I called my mom, and she didn't even ask any questions. She just said it was fine. Part of me knew I should probably call 911 and report this dangerous woman wandering around. But that would mean talking to the cops and getting involved, and I just couldn't handle that right then. I peeked out of every single window facing the street. The courtyard was completely empty. The woman was gone. I just wanted to completely erase the whole bizarre thing from my memory. But how could I? She just didn't look normal. She didn't even look human. Honestly, she looked worse than a corpse. After hanging up with my mom, I walked into the guest room, the room I always slept in. It used to be my grandpa's bedroom. He passed away years ago, but Grandma pretty much kept it exactly the same. His old books were still on the shelves, and that classic desk lamp with the green glass shade was still sitting there. There was a big floral rug on the floor, and the wall was completely covered in dozens of old framed family photographs. It had a little twin bed with a quilt and perfectly fluffed pillows. Everything was always in its exact right place. Walking into that room always gave me this mix of comfort and sadness. I barely even remembered him, but I knew how much it broke Grandma's heart to lose him. They had spent their entire lives together. I clicked on the little desk lamp. I usually loved just sitting in there with the dim lighting. It was the perfect spot to curl up with a good book. But that night, I just couldn't do it. My nerves were completely shot from what had just happened. These impossible, terrifying images just kept flashing in my mind. That wrinkled, lumpy face with those stitched-on eyes and mouth. The way she ran. Her head was flopping so violently it was hitting her chest and snapping back, and her arms were just undulating, folding up like an accordion. It was physically impossible. No human being could move like that. She was like a literal monster from a campfire story. I hadn't believed in stuff like that since I was a little kid. But I guess there's always room for things you just can't explain. Some things just don't have logical answers. A minute later, Grandma walked into the room carrying a mug of hot tea and a little plate of cookies. She told me a really good show was about to start on TV. You want to come watch with me? Grandma asked. No, I've got homework, I lied. I'll just listen from in here. She gave me this sweet, proud look. Look at you, being so responsible, she said, before heading out to give me some quiet time. The muffled sound of the TV drifted into the room. I just sat there with my cooling tea, staring at the gallery wall. Shadows from the streetlights were playing across the glass of the picture frames. I used to imagine little figures dancing in those dark reflections. But now, they seemed to twitch and jerk, perfectly matching my panicked heartbeat. About an hour or so went by. I really did have studying to do, but I just couldn't focus. I figured I'd wake up early and tackle it with a clear head. It was already past 10 anyway. I pulled back the covers, clicked off the little green lamp, and slid into bed. The sheets were still cool, and it felt amazing. All that tight tension in my muscles slowly started melting away. I sank into the mattress, and even though my shoulder was throbbing, I honestly didn't care. The room was pitch black, except for this one skinny sliver of street light slipping through the curtains. An old, soothing Patsy Cline song was drifting in from Grandma's TV. I always loved that tune. I shut my eyes and tried to force my brain to think about normal, boring stuff. Classes, homework, just everyday life. But that tiny bit of peace didn't last long. Right outside my window, down on the ground, I heard this very distinct wet, squelching sound. My chest instantly burned, and a sharp spike of pain shot through my shoulder. I desperately wanted to stay put. It felt so much safer hiding under the blankets. I tried to tell myself to just wait until morning, but I couldn't do it. I had to know what was out there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just somebody walking through a muddy puddle. I dragged myself out of bed, crept over to the window, and peeked through the curtains. It was her. That terrifying woman was pacing around the courtyard, like she was hunting for something. I gripped the curtain fabric so tight I almost ripped it right off the rod. She looked exactly the same, like a waterlogged, rotting stuffed animal. She wasn't alive, but she wasn't dead either. It completely defied logic. I wanted to drop the curtain, dive back into bed, and pull the covers over my head like a little kid. But suddenly, she snapped her head up. She locked her eyes right onto my window. Then, she slowly raised her arm and pointed a swollen finger straight at me. I yanked the curtains shut and practically flew back to the bed. I buried myself under the blankets, pressing my face hard into the pillow. My heart was hammering out of my chest. I could still hear those awful, wet footsteps down below. I tried so hard to calm down. The door is locked, I told myself. Even if she somehow gets inside the building, she can't get into this apartment. I'm totally safe. But the terror wouldn't stop. Every wet slap against the pavement felt like a punch to the gut. She can't get in. This room is safe. And then, the footsteps just stopped. The courtyard went dead silent. I strained my ears, holding my breath. The bed springs squeaked every time I moved. A super upbeat commercial jingle started playing from Grandma's TV, which just felt completely wrong. I kept waiting to hear the heavy metal door downstairs creak open. But instead, I heard this awful scraping noise coming from right outside my window. It sounded exactly like fingernails clawing against the brick exterior. It took my brain a second to process what that meant. And then the most horrifying thought hit me. Is she actually scaling the wall? Is she crawling up to my window? I had to prove myself wrong. I forced myself to walk back over there. My hand was sweating as I grabbed the edge of the curtain and pulled it back just a tiny fraction of an inch. Silence. The courtyard was totally empty. No footsteps, no scratching. For one split second, I thought the nightmare was actually over. I wanted to believe it so badly. But then, a massive, swollen hand slammed onto the metal window ledge. And that grotesque face pressed right up against the glass. Those awful, stitched-on doll eyes were staring directly into mine. I opened my mouth to scream, but absolutely nothing came out. The fear just completely paralyzed my vocal cords. Instantly, that same splitting headache from the park came crashing back. I grabbed the sides of my head. It wasn't a normal headache. It felt like this strange, invasive pain being forced into my brain from the outside. And the craziest part was, It brought this overwhelming, specific emotion with it. It was exactly like that song. Just this overwhelming wave of pure grief and total despair. Then, a second hand slapped against the glass. The palm and fingers were absolutely bristling with sewing needles. She pounded on the glass twice, and there was a loud, sharp crack. It was an old apartment building, and the wooden window frame was completely dried out and warped. The flimsy lock on the sash just popped right open. I knew right then she was getting inside. Either the frame was going to give way entirely, or she was going to shatter the glass. I couldn't hold her back. I didn't even stop to think. I just bolted for the bedroom door. Right behind me, there was a massive crash. The window violently slammed open, ripping the curtain right off the rod. That awful moan echoed through the walls. Why? I sprinted down the hallway toward the flickering light of the TV. "Grandma! Grandma!" I screamed, bursting into the living room. She was just sitting there silently in her recliner, staring straight at the screen. Her arm was dangling off the side, and her head was slumped over. I dropped to my knees next to her. "Nana." Her eyes were closed. I thought maybe she had just fallen asleep, but the second I touched her shoulder, she completely collapsed onto the floor. I panicked, leaning my ear right against her chest. She was breathing. Faintly, but she was alive. Suddenly, it all made sense. That creature was flooding the apartment with this heavy, toxic energy. It was suffocating me, but for my frail grandma, it was just too much for her body to handle. I desperately tried to shake her awake, but she wouldn't budge. Somewhere down the hall, that terrifying voice echoed again. Why? I couldn't let that thing get to her. I ran out of the living room, pulled the door completely shut behind me, and bolted for the kitchen. Part of me just wanted to run out the front door and escape, but I could never abandon my grandma to that monster. That would be the ultimate betrayal. I hit the kitchen and realized I was trapped. It was a dead end. I had to figure something out, fast. I frantically yanked open the nearest drawer. I grabbed a potato masher and chucked it on the floor. Useless. I grabbed a spatula. Tossed that too. I kept digging frantically until my hand closed around a heavy, sharp chef's knife. Just as I pulled it out, that bloated woman appeared right in the kitchen doorway. She saw me, and her arm twitched. I instantly knew what was coming and dropped straight to the floor. A split second later, a massive cloud of sewing needles shot right over my head. They slammed into the wooden cabinets, ricocheted off the walls, and showered down onto my back. I scrambled forward on the tiles. At the exact same time, she lunged at me. I don't even know how I did it, but she basically impaled herself right on the blade. The knife sank into her stomach, all the way to the handle. The swollen woman just froze. For a second, it almost looked like her stitched-on eyes widened in surprise. She slowly stumbled backward, pulling off the blade, leaving the knife in my hand. This thick, horrific sludge started pouring out of her stomach. It looked like rotting guts mixed with soaking wet stuffing. Great big clumps of it splattered onto the kitchen floor, and the stench of decay was absolutely blinding. "Why?" She whimpered pitifully, desperately trying to hold her stomach together. But it was too late. Her whole body was literally coming apart at the seams, just deflating and losing all its mass. She shriveled up, her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor. I slowly stood up. My heart was pounding out of my chest, but all the fear was completely gone. Now it was just a disgusting pile of wet rags, cotton, and rotting meat sitting at my feet. Why? I muttered. For everything good in the world. Instantly, that splitting headache vanished. The crushing grief just evaporated, and my mind felt completely clear. I dropped the bloody knife, suddenly remembering Grandma. I leaped over the foul pile and sprinted back to the living room. "Grandma!" I yelled. She slowly lifted her head from the floor. "Oh my! Grandma, you're alive!" I cried, practically sobbing with joy. "Alive? What on earth am I doing on the floor?" "Goodness gracious, how embarrassing," she mumbled, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I grabbed her arm and helped her sit up. "Should I call 911? I asked. "Oh, hush, I don't need an ambulance. Just go to bed, Emmy," she said, brushing herself off and slowly standing up. I could have cried from pure happiness. She was completely fine. What a relief. She straightened out her robe and calmly walked right out of the room. "It smells terrible in here. Did a pipe burst or something?" Grandma mumbled, shuffling down the hallway in her slippers. I followed right behind her, frantically trying to figure out how I was going to explain the mess. I honestly thought I had no choice but to tell her the truth. But when she flipped the kitchen light switch, the room was completely spotless. There were no dirty rags or rotting guts on the floor. The only things out of place were an open drawer, some scattered utensils, and that lingering, putrid smell. Where the hell did the remains of that monster go? For the longest time, I just couldn't process what had happened. I convinced myself I had hallucinated the whole thing. I figured I must have had some kind of psychotic break, sleepwalking around the apartment, running from an imaginary monster. But then, a while later, I started hearing rumors about something they found in the woods. People were saying that when the snow melted in early spring, the police discovered a gruesome, decomposing body. The weirdest part? The corpse was completely wrapped in old rags and heavy thread, like someone had tried to turn the poor woman into a life-size doll. They couldn't identify the body for the longest time, but the truth finally came out. Right near those woods, there was an old, abandoned trailer park where squatters and addicts used to crash. Apparently, a mother and her 40-year-old son had been living in one of the rundown trailers. They both struggled with severe alcoholism. Sometime during the winter, the mother died. Her son had actually beaten her to death, so he didn't dare tell anyone, terrified of going to prison. He just kept living in that freezing trailer with her corpse. He told the neighbors she was just feeling a little under the weather and staying in bed. But when her body started to decompose, the guy decided to fix it. He took rags and sewing thread and literally tried to stitch her a new face. He wrapped up her arms and her entire body, basically turning her into a giant rag doll. Did it hide the smell? Of course not. Why he did it, he couldn't even explain. His mind was just completely gone. A month went by, and the stench became unbearable. So, the son dragged his mother's body out into the woods and buried her in the snow so nobody would see. And she stayed there until spring. They found her right after the night she came after me. I still don't know why she locked onto me. Maybe she confused me with her son. Or maybe she just wanted to make herself seen so someone would finally find her. And she just kept repeating her final words. Why? Why? The whole story just made me sick to my stomach. But at the same time, I couldn't even bring myself to feel sorry for her. Growing up in our quiet suburban bubble, you just didn't hear about things like that. We lived in this perfectly safe world, completely sheltered from the gritty, dark reality of life. Just complete madness and violence happening right under our noses. If you told a middle school kid about that kind of darkness, they'd never believe it. But somehow, that darkness slipped into our world anyway, and I never saw another ghost for the rest of my life.